It was an ordinary morning when the news of her death spread through the small town like wildfire. Emma was only 15, a young girl full of life, laughter, and dreams. She had a unique way of making everyone around her smile, whether it was through her infectious laugh, her curiosity about the world, or the funny stories she loved to tell. No one could have predicted that just days ago, the vibrant, energetic girl who had always been so full of life would suddenly be gone. Emma had been battling an illness for a while, but her family and friends held on to hope that she would recover. But as time went on, the illness proved too much for her body. The moment she passed away, it felt as if the whole world had shifted. Emma was loved by everyone, her family, her friends, even her teachers at school. It was almost as if she brought light wherever she went. The thought of living without her was unimaginable for the people who knew her best. The news hit hardest for her parents, who were still trying to process the fact that their little girl, their first child, was gone. Her mother, Sarah, couldn't stop crying. She would walk around the house, her eyes filled with disbelief, clutching the things Emma had left behind. The little notes she had written, the colorful drawings she made when she was younger, the soft toys that had once comforted her when she was afraid. For Sarah, every corner of the house seemed to hold a memory of Emma, and it was hard to let go of that. Despite the overwhelming sadness, the funeral arrangements were quickly made. They decided to hold a private ceremony. Emma's extended family and close friends would be there, but they wanted to keep things simple. A quiet goodbye was what her parents felt was right. It wasn't just a farewell to their daughter. It was the final moment of sharing her with the world, a chance for everyone to honor her life. Emma had always loved animals, and one of her greatest companions had been her pet Parrot. The bird had been with her for years, ever since she was a little girl. The parrot had been more than just a pet, it was like family. Emma had trained the bird to speak a few words, and it often mimicked her voice, repeating lines she had said to her family, or even her favorite songs. Her parents would often hear the bird singing along with Emma as she went about her day. The family wasn't sure how the bird would react when they told it that Emma was gone. After all, the parrot had never been apart from her for long periods. The morning of the funeral, the bird seemed unsettled. It squawked more than usual and flew around the house, pacing in an agitated way. It was almost as if the bird knew something was wrong, that something big was about to happen. Sarah tried to keep the parrot inside, but it refused to stay still, constantly flying toward the windows as if trying to get outside. She couldn't help but wonder if the bird somehow understood what was coming. The funeral procession was set to begin, and the day was heavy with sadness. The sky was overcast, and the quiet hum of the town seemed to reflect the mood of the people. Emma's friends gathered, quietly speaking among themselves, remembering her with tears in their eyes. The church was filled with mourners, people who had known Emma for years, and others who had just heard of her kind spirit. When the family arrived at the burial site, everything felt surreal. The coffin, draped with flowers and carefully arranged, sat beside the open grave. People stood in silence, unsure of what to say or do. Emma's parents, walking slowly behind the casket, exchanged quiet, broken words, their hearts aching in the most unimaginable way. Her father, David, held his wife's hand tightly, trying to offer comfort, though it was clear that he, too, was struggling with the reality of losing his daughter. As they began the ceremony, there was a strange quiet in the air, so still, it almost felt like time had stopped. The only sounds were the soft words of the officiant, the occasional sniffle from someone in the crowd, and the distant caw of a crow. And then, out of nowhere, something unexpected happened that no one could have predicted, not even the family who had loved Emma so deeply. The funeral was taking place on a cool, overcast morning, and despite the somber occasion, something odd seemed to be happening. As the service continued, Emma's family and friends stood together in their grief, but something was off. It was as if there was an unspoken tension in the air, something everyone felt but couldn't quite put into words. But it wasn't just the sadness of the moment. there was another presence that no one had expected. Emma's beloved parrot, which had always been so close to her, was acting strangely. The bird, usually calm and content, seemed restless and agitated. It was as though it sensed the heaviness of the day. From the moment the sun had risen that morning, the parrot had been flying around the house, squawking and fluttering its wings as if something was wrong. It wasn't like the usual behavior the bird showed when it was hungry or tired. It was different, almost as if the parrot knew that Emma was gone. Sarah, Emma's mother, tried to calm the parrot, but it refused to stay in one place. The bird hopped from perch to perch, ruffled its feathers, and chirped loudly. For a moment, Sarah wondered if it was just acting out due to the sudden change in the routine of the household, but as the bird flew around the house again, Sarah's heart sank. She couldn't help but feel that the bird, in some strange way, understood what had happened. The bond between Emma and the parrot had been special. Emma had spent countless hours with the bird, teaching it to speak, playing with it, and even letting it sit on her shoulder as she did her homework. But on this day, the parrot was behaving differently. It wasn't just chirping or flapping its wings in frustration. It was acting as if it had a purpose, as if it needed to be somewhere. Sarah tried to open the window to let the bird outside, but it wouldn't go. Instead, the bird flew directly toward the door, squawking loudly, and refused to stay inside. The more Sarah tried to control the parrot, the more it seemed intent on getting outside, almost as if it were drawn to something beyond the house. It was as if the bird was sensing the grief of the family, and something inside it was urging it to join the funeral procession. As the family made their way to the cemetery, the bird followed closely behind them. It wasn't long before the parrot had somehow managed to escape from the house and fly outside. It hovered above the family as they walked to the burial site, its feathers shimmering in the dull daylight. The bird flew high above them, circling in the air as if guiding them toward something. The family could hear the loud squawks of the parrot echoing in the distance, but they didn't think much of it at first. They were already lost in their sorrow, too focused on the painful task ahead to notice the bird's strange behavior. But when they arrived at the cemetery, something truly unexpected happened. As the mourners gathered and the coffin was lowered into the ground, the parrot flew straight into the scene. Everyone turned to see the bird swooping down from the sky. It wasn't just any bird. It was Emma's parrot, the same one that had been a part of her life for so long. The bird landed right on top of the coffin, and without hesitation, settled down next to it. It perched there, silent for a moment, as if observing the ceremony from above. For a moment, there was complete silence. The mourners watched, eyes wide with disbelief. The parrot had flown directly to the coffin of the girl it had been so close to. It didn't seem frightened or confused. On the contrary, it appeared calm, as if it had arrived to pay its final respects. It was as if the bird understood what had happened in a way that no one else could comprehend. Some of the people in the crowd began to whisper among themselves. "What is it doing here?" One person asked. Another whispered, "Do you think it knows?" The question lingered in the air, hanging between the crowd, but no one had an answer. Sarah stood there, stunned by the sight, unable to move. She looked at the bird, and for a moment, she felt a strange sense of peace. It was as if Emma had sent a part of herself with the parrot to say goodbye. The parrot stayed on the coffin for a while, just sitting there in the stillness of the graveyard, as though it were waiting for something. No one knew what would happen next, but in that moment, everyone present felt the weight of the bird's presence. Something about it felt different, almost magical. But as the ceremony continued, no one could have predicted what was going to unfold next. The moment the parrot landed on the coffin, everyone in the crowd seemed to freeze. It wasn't just the family who was stunned. The entire gathering of mourners was silent, watching in awe as the bird sat quietly on top of the casket. The atmosphere was thick with disbelief, and yet there was something almost peaceful about the scene. The bird, Emma's beloved parrot, was now part of the ceremony in a way no one had ever expected. It was as though it had come to fulfill some unspoken role, something more than just a pet, more than just a companion. It seemed to have a deeper connection with Emma than anyone had imagined. As the officiant continued the service, speaking words of comfort for those mourning the loss of the young girl, the parrot remained perfectly still, its bright feathers shining softly in the gray daylight. It made no sound, offering only the occasional flutter of its wings as it sat atop the coffin. The crowd, still shocked by the bird's presence, couldn't take their eyes off it. For a few moments, it felt as if the parrot itself was part of the ritual, almost as though it understood the gravity of the situation. Sarah, Emma's mother, stood nearby, her eyes wide with surprise. She hadn't known how to feel about the parrot's strange behavior that morning. At first, she thought it might just be a coincidence, but now, watching it perched so carefully on her daughter's coffin, she began to wonder if it was something more. Was this a sign? Was the bird somehow connected to Emma in a way that no one could explain? Sarah's mind raced with questions. She could feel a lump in her throat as she watched the bird's small, steady form on the coffin. It was almost as if the bird, too, was grieving, mourning its loss in its own way. Some of the people in the crowd murmured to each other, still trying to understand what they were witnessing. "Is it waiting for her to wake up?" One person whispered, though they immediately shook their head at the thought. Another wondered aloud, "Does the bird know that she's gone?" The answers remained unclear, and the mystery of the bird's actions only deepened with every passing minute. David, Emma's father, watched from a distance, his heart heavy with sadness. The sight of the bird made him feel a strange mix of emotions. On one hand, he couldn't understand why the bird would choose this moment to act in such an extraordinary way. But on the other hand, he felt something comforting about it, as if the parrot's presence was a reminder that Emma's spirit was still near. He had always known how much Emma had loved that bird, how they had spent hours together. The bird often perched on her shoulder as she played or did her homework. He had never expected that the bird would be here, at this moment, in this way. But somehow, it seemed to make sense. The bird didn't leave. It stayed on the coffin for what seemed like an eternity, sitting there as the ceremony continued. The sun, which had been hidden behind clouds, now broke through the misty sky for a brief moment, casting a soft glow over the grave. In that quiet moment, something shifted in the air. For a brief second, the sadness that had filled the space seemed to lift, replaced by a strange sense of calm. People who had been crying, overcome with grief, found themselves pausing, as though in awe of what was happening. Some of the mourners began to reach for their phones, quietly taking photos of the parrot on the coffin. But no one spoke. It felt as if the moment was too sacred to interrupt. The bird, with its steady gaze and quiet presence, had become the symbol of the ceremony. It wasn't just Emma's pet, it had become part of her story, part of her legacy. As the final words of the service were spoken, the officiant began to close the ceremony, his voice soft but steady. Sarah and David stepped forward to say their final goodbyes. The crowd watched them with sympathy and respect, but all eyes still lingered on the parrot. Finally, Sarah, wiping away her tears, stepped closer to the bird. She gently reached out, as if to comfort it, and as her hand neared, the bird let out a soft chirp, as if acknowledging her presence. The moment was fleeting, but it felt deeply significant. After the ceremony, the crowd slowly began to disperse, and the family was left standing at the edge of the grave, their hearts heavy with grief. The parrot had flown away, disappearing into the sky, but its presence lingered in the air. For a moment, everything felt surreal. The family, still in shock from the strange events, didn't know what to make of what had just happened. Was it simply a coincidence, or was there something deeper behind the parrot's actions that no one could quite understand? As Sarah and David walked back toward their car, they remained silent, lost in their thoughts. The weight of the day had been overwhelming, and the bizarre occurrence with the bird only added to their confusion. They had tried to make sense of the moment, but the more they thought about it, the more questions they had. Was it possible that the bird had known something that no one else could? Or was it simply a random act of nature, an animal behaving in a way that humans couldn't comprehend? Sarah, in particular, couldn't shake the image of the parrot sitting on the coffin. It had been so still, so calm, as if it had understood the importance of the moment. She kept thinking about how much Emma had loved that bird, how they had been inseparable. The parrot had been a part of Emma's life for so many years, and now, in this strange and unexpected way, it had become a part of Emma's farewell. The thought brought both comfort and sadness to Sarah's heart. In a way, it was as though Emma had sent the bird to say goodbye, a final gesture of love from beyond. Back at the family home, the bird's behavior continued to weigh on their minds. The parrot, once confined to a small cage in the corner of the living room, was now a constant reminder of Emma. Sarah had always known that the bird meant a great deal to her daughter, but she hadn't fully realized the depth of their bond until that moment. It wasn't just a pet, it was a companion, a friend who had shared in Emma's joys, her laughter, and even her sorrows. As the days passed, the family tried to return to some sense of normalcy. The funeral was over, and the house, which had once been filled with Emma's laughter, now felt eerily quiet. But the parrot, despite its initial restlessness that morning, seemed to settle down. It no longer paced around the house or squawked loudly. It was calm, almost serene. Sarah couldn't help but wonder if the bird, too, was grieving in its own way. After all, it had lost its lifelong companion, and now it was left behind, just like the rest of them. One evening, Sarah found herself sitting in the living room, staring out the window. The house felt cold and empty without Emma's presence. As she sat there, the parrot suddenly flew down from its perch and landed on the arm of the chair beside her. The bird seemed to look at her for a moment, its bright eyes meeting hers, as if to offer some kind of unspoken comfort. For a brief moment, Sarah felt as though she wasn't alone. The bird, in its quiet way, had become a connection to Emma, a way for her to hold on to the memory of her daughter just a little bit longer. But it wasn't just Sarah who noticed the bird's strange behavior. David, too, began to feel the weight of its presence. He had always been the more practical one, the one who tried to keep his emotions in check, but even he couldn't deny that there was something unusual about the parrot. It seemed to follow him around the house, perched on different spots as if keeping watch. At times, when David would walk into a room, the bird would suddenly begin chirping softly, almost as if calling to him. It wasn't the usual playful squawking that they had heard before. It was a soft, gentle sound, one that seemed to echo in the quiet of the house. One evening, as the family sat together for dinner, the parrot did something that no one could have predicted. It suddenly flew over to the kitchen table, landing right in front of Emma's empty chair. For a moment, everyone stopped and stared. The bird seemed to be waiting for something. It hopped around on the table, looking at each of them in turn, almost as though it were trying to remind them of the bond they had shared with Emma. The silence in the room was deafening as the family looked at each other, unsure of how to react. David, who had been the first to break the silence, simply said, "It's like she's still here with us." His voice was quiet, and for a moment, it seemed as though the weight of his words hung in the air. The parrot's behavior continued to be a mystery, and the family began to accept that they might never fully understand what had happened. But what they did know was that the bird had become a symbol of Emma's memory. It was a constant reminder of the love she had shared with them. And in its own way, the bird was helping them heal. The days following the funeral passed by slowly, each one blending into the next with a feeling of emptiness. The house, once filled with the sounds of Emma's laughter and the playful chatter between her and the parrot, now seemed quiet and still. Sarah and David struggled to find a sense of normalcy. The grief they felt from losing their daughter hung over them like a heavy cloud, and nothing seemed to lift it. The house, once a place of joy, felt cold and foreign. Yet, as they moved through their days, they began to notice something strange. The parrot, Emma's faithful companion, continued to behave in ways that were difficult to explain. It had always been a lively bird, full of energy and personality. But since the funeral, it had become strangely quiet. At times, it would sit in its cage, staring out of the window, almost as if it were deep in thought. Other times, it would perch on the back of a chair, watching Sarah and David as they went about their routines, its eyes following their every move. It was as though the bird, too, was trying to make sense of the loss. Sarah had always thought of the parrot as just a pet, but now it seemed to be much more than that. It was as if the bird had a deep understanding of what had happened, and in its own way, it was grieving with them. Sarah found herself comforted by the parrot's presence. The quiet way it watched her, the soft chirps it made as if trying to communicate, brought a strange sense of peace. It reminded her of Emma, of the way the bird had always been a part of her life, always near her, always there to brighten her day. David, too, began to feel the weight of the bird's presence. He had always been more practical, focusing on the tasks at hand, but now he found himself taking moments to sit quietly with the parrot. He would watch the bird as it moved around the room, sometimes mimicking Emma's voice, repeating phrases she had taught it. It was as if the bird was trying to fill the space Emma had left behind, trying to bring a little piece of her back into their lives. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, the parrot did something that caught them both off guard. It hopped down from its perch and walked across the floor toward them. At first, neither Sarah nor David knew what to make of it, but as the bird got closer, it stopped right in front of them, looking up at them with its bright eyes. For a moment, the room was silent. The bird, which had been so quiet in the days following the funeral, seemed to be waiting for something. Sarah, still recovering from the shock of losing her daughter, slowly reached out her hand. The parrot didn't flinch or shy away. Instead, it stepped forward, resting its small head in the palm of her hand. It was a gentle gesture, one that felt almost like a connection, as if the bird was offering her comfort in its own way. For Sarah, it was a moment of calm amidst the storm of her grief. The touch of the bird's soft feathers against her skin reminded her of Emma's tenderness, of the love they had shared. David, watching from the side, felt the same sense of peace. He wasn't sure how to explain it, but the parrot's actions seemed to have a calming effect on both of them. It was as though the bird, in its quiet way, was offering them a reminder of what they had lost, but also of the love that still remained. Emma might be gone, but in some strange way, the parrot was still here, holding on to her memory, keeping it alive. As the days passed, Sarah and David found themselves relying more and more on the bird. It wasn't just a pet anymore. It had become a part of their healing process. When the sadness felt too overwhelming, they would sit with the bird, listen to it chirp softly, and let the sound comfort them. At times, the bird would even mimic Emma's laughter, and for a fleeting moment, it almost felt like she was still with them, laughing along with them. The family began to talk about the bird more often, sharing stories of Emma and the parrot's special bond. They would remember how Emma had spent hours teaching the bird to speak, laughing as the bird repeated her favorite songs and phrases. The parrot had always been so much more than just a pet to Emma. It had been her confidant, her companion, and now, in its own way, it had become a bridge to the past, a way for them to keep Emma's memory alive. One afternoon, as Sarah was sitting by the window, the parrot suddenly flew over and landed on the windowsill. It looked out over the garden, where Emma had once played. Sarah watched as the bird sat quietly, its eyes focused on something in the distance. It was as if the bird was remembering, too, reflecting on the moments it had shared with Emma. The sight was bittersweet, but it also brought a sense of comfort. The bird had become a symbol of hope in the midst of their sorrow. As time went on, the small town where Sarah and David lived began to hear whispers about the unusual events surrounding Emma's funeral. The parrot, which had flown to the cemetery and perched on the coffin, became the talk of the community. People who had attended the funeral couldn't stop talking about it. Some believed the bird's actions were simply a strange coincidence, while others felt there was something more to it. something deeper and more mysterious. The story quickly spread through the town, with friends, neighbors, and even strangers coming to Sarah and David to ask about the parrot. Everyone wanted to know more about what had happened that day, what the bird's strange behavior meant, and whether it was truly a sign of some kind. Some people offered their own theories, trying to explain why the parrot had behaved the way it did. Maybe the bird was trying to say goodbye. One neighbor suggested. Perhaps it was Emma's way of telling us he was at peace, said another. At first, Sarah and David were hesitant to talk about the incident too much. It was still so raw, and they weren't sure how to explain what they had seen. The bird's behavior had been deeply emotional and confusing. They were still trying to process everything themselves, and they weren't ready to share their thoughts with everyone who came knocking on their door. But soon, they realized that the parrot's actions had sparked something much bigger than they had expected. The town had become fascinated by the story, and it seemed to be helping others in ways they hadn't anticipated. One morning, a local reporter arrived at the house. She had heard about the parrot's actions and wanted to know if she could interview Sarah and David for the local newspaper. At first, Sarah was reluctant, but the reporter's gentle approach and kind words helped ease her nerves. The reporter explained that many people in the town were touched by the story, and they felt it might help others who were struggling with loss. "I understand how hard this must be for you," the reporter said, "but your story has already made an impact. People are talking about it. They find comfort in the idea that the bond between Emma and the bird was so strong, and maybe it gives them hope that love doesn't end with death." After much consideration, Sarah and David agreed to share their story. They spoke about the parrot's strange behavior, the way it had flown to the cemetery, and how it had become a symbol of Emma's lasting presence. They talked about how the bird had comforted them in their grief, becoming a constant reminder of the love they had shared with their daughter. They also mentioned how, over time, the bird seemed to carry a piece of Emma with it, repeating her words and songs, bringing a sense of familiarity and peace to their home. As the article was published, the family received an outpouring of support from people they had never met. Letters, cards, and flowers arrived at their doorstep, all expressing sympathy for their loss and admiration for their strength. Many people wrote about how the story of the parrot had helped them cope with their own grief. Some said they had lost a loved one recently and found comfort in knowing that love could transcend even death. Others shared their own stories of unexpected signs from loved ones who had passed and how those signs had helped them heal. The parrot became something of a local legend. People began to visit the family home, hoping to see the bird and perhaps catch a glimpse of the connection it shared with Emma. Sarah and David were initially taken aback by the attention, but they soon realized that the bird had become more than just a pet. It had become a symbol of hope and love for the entire community. The parrot's behavior continued to fascinate everyone. It was as if the bird had taken on a new role, not just as Emma's companion, but as a messenger of sorts. People came from neighboring towns, hoping to see the bird, hoping to feel the same sense of comfort that others had described. The bird, despite its calm and quiet nature, had become an important part of the town's collective healing process. It was a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there could be moments of light, unexpected signs of love and connection that helped people find their way through their sorrow. As the months passed, Sarah and David found that the parrot's presence in their home began to feel more like a blessing than a burden. They still missed Emma every day, and the pain of her absence never truly went away. But the bird, with its quiet companionship, helped fill the space Emma had left behind. It reminded them that Emma's love was still with them, in a way that they could see and feel every day. The parrot had done more than offer comfort to Sarah and David. As the months passed, life slowly began to regain some sense of normalcy, though it was never quite the same. Sarah and David have found a new rhythm in their lives, one shaped by the loss of Emma, but also influenced by the constant presence of her parrot. While the pain of losing their daughter never fully faded, the bird's companionship had given them something to hold on to, something that reminded them of Emma's spirit and love. The bird, once just a pet, had become a bridge between the past and the present, a symbol of both grief and healing. Sarah and David often found themselves sitting together in the evenings, watching the bird as it moved around the room, singing softly or repeating words that had once belonged to Emma. In many ways, it felt as though the bird was carrying a piece of Emma's soul, a small piece of her that would always remain with them. It was comforting in its own way, and while it didn't replace the emptiness they felt, it provided them with moments of peace. Over time, the bird had also started to display new behaviors that continued to leave the family puzzled and fascinated. It would often fly over to where Emma's favorite books had been left untouched since her passing. It seemed to linger near them, staring at the covers as if remembering the times when Emma had read to it, or when they had spent time together in that very spot. On some days, the bird would sit by the window for hours, gazing outside, almost as if it were waiting for something, or perhaps someone. Sarah sometimes wondered if the bird had become aware of its own place in the world, how it had become a symbol of something more than just an animal, how it had connected with Emma in ways beyond their understanding. One afternoon, as Sarah sat on the couch, the parrot did something that made her heart skip a beat. The bird, which had always been quiet in the mornings, suddenly began to mimic a song that Emma used to sing all the time. It was a song that Emma had written herself, a sweet little tune that she had sung when she was younger. Sarah had almost forgotten the words, but when she heard the parrot singing them softly, she felt as if Emma's presence filled the room. The bird's voice was soft, sweet, and familiar, and for a few moments, Sarah allowed herself to close her eyes and imagine that Emma was still there, singing along with the bird. David, who had been sitting in the kitchen, heard the song and came into the room, drawn by the familiar sound. He stopped in the doorway, his eyes wide with surprise and emotion. It was as if the bird had unlocked a memory, bringing back the image of Emma in a way that words couldn't express. The moment was bittersweet, a reminder of what they had lost, but also a reminder of the love that had never left. The bird had somehow managed to keep that love alive, singing the song that Emma had once sung with such joy. The days went on, and life slowly began to return to its routine. Sarah and David found comfort in their daily activities, but the parrot had become an integral part of their healing process. They began to see the bird not just as a reminder of their daughter, but as a companion in their grief, a companion that didn't ask for anything, but simply offered a sense of peace. One evening, the bird did something else that took Sarah by surprise. As she was sitting in the living room, feeling particularly weighed down by the day's events, the parrot flew over to her and gently landed on her shoulder. It wasn't something the bird had done before. It usually preferred to remain in its cage or on a nearby perch. But this time, it chose to sit close to Sarah, as if offering her its company and comfort. She gently reached up and stroked its feathers, feeling a small connection between herself and the bird. It was as if the bird understood her sadness, understood that she missed Emma in a way that words couldn't capture. Sarah felt a tear slip down her cheek, but it wasn't just a tear of sorrow. It was a tear of healing, a tear that was slowly being shed as she learned to live without her daughter, yet still honor her memory. As the weeks went by, the bird continued to bring small moments of comfort, and the house began to feel a little less empty. The air was still filled with the echoes of Emma's laughter and the songs she had once sung, but the bird had become a reminder that even though life changed, love remained constant. Sarah and David often found themselves reflecting on the strange series of events that had brought the parrot into their lives, and how, in its own way, it had helped them heal. What started as a simple pet had become a symbol of love and memory, a constant reminder that even in the face of great loss, there could still be moments of beauty and peace. The bird had carried Emma's spirit forward, helping them to keep her alive in their hearts and minds, even as they learned to live without her. As time went on, the small town began to see the story of Emma and her parrot as more than just a tale of grief. It had become a symbol of enduring love and unexpected comfort. The strange bond between the bird and the girl had touched the hearts of many, and people would often talk about it, reflecting on the powerful connection between the two. For Sarah and David, the journey of healing was still ongoing, but they had found solace in a way they hadn't expected. The parrot had, in its own quiet way, helped them move forward, even as they carried the weight of their loss. The bird continued to mimic Emma's favorite songs and words, bringing both joy and sadness to the family. Sometimes, when the house was quiet, Sarah would catch herself smiling at the sound of the bird's voice, echoing the moments that felt so distant now. It was a bittersweet comfort, one that reminded her of the times when Emma had been alive and full of energy. The parrot, for all its odd behavior, had become a living memory of Emma, a piece of her that refused to fade away. One evening, Sarah sat by the window, looking out over the garden where Emma had once played. The bird was perched on its usual spot, a small stool by the window, its bright eyes watching her, as if it understood her need for reflection. Sarah had spent so many moments like this, trying to hold on to the memories of her daughter, even as the pain of losing her remained. And yet, in the stillness of the evening, with the parrot nearby, she felt a sense of peace, an understanding that Emma was still with them, in the form of the bird that had never left their side. David, too, had come to terms with the bird's role in their lives. He wasn't the emotional one in the family, but he couldn't deny that the parrot had given him something to hold on to. Over time, he had begun to see the bird as more than just a reminder of the past. It had become a living presence in their home, a constant source of companionship and quiet understanding. There were times when David would simply sit with the bird, listening to its soft chirps and the occasional mimic of Emma's laughter. It was as if the bird was telling him that it was okay to remember, and that it was okay to move forward too. The small moments they shared with the bird, whether it was the quiet humming of a familiar song or the way the bird would sit next to them, its head tilted as if listening to their thoughts, became important to the family. They had come to accept that grief wasn't something that could be fixed, but something that would always be a part of them. The parrot didn't erase their pain, but it helped them cope. It reminded them that while their daughter was no longer with them, love could still be felt in unexpected ways. As the years passed, the story of Emma and her parrot became a cherished memory for Sarah and David. The bird continued to live in their home, its feathers as bright as ever, its voice still echoing the words and songs that had once belonged to Emma. The parrot had long outlived its usual life expectancy, and in a way, it had become a symbol of the enduring bond between the girl and her pet. People in the town would often stop by to see the bird, many of them hearing about the strange events that had surrounded Emma's passing. And every time someone asked about the parrot, Sarah and David would share the story, remembering the bird's unwavering loyalty and the way it had helped them heal. Eventually, the bird became a legend in the town, a reminder of how love can transcend death. People would speak of it as if it were a sign, a small miracle that had touched their lives. But for Sarah and David, the bird remained more than just a symbol. It was a living connection to Emma, a companion that had shared in their sorrow, and over time, helped them find peace. The bird had done what no one else could. It had carried Emma's memory forward, and in doing so, it had given Sarah and David the strength to continue living. One day, many years later, as the parrot perched on its usual spot by the window, Sarah found herself reflecting on the journey they had been through. The bird had been a constant presence in their lives, a part of the healing process that they had never expected. It wasn't just the bird that had made a difference, it was the love they had shared with Emma, and the way that love had carried on, even in her absence. As Sarah watched the parrot, she felt a deep sense of gratitude for the bird, for the love they had shared, and for the small moments that made life worth living, even after loss. In the end, the story of the parrot was not just about a bird that had acted out of the ordinary. It was about the love between a girl and her pet, and the way that love had never truly disappeared. Emma was gone, but her memory lived on in the bird, in the house, and in the hearts of everyone who had known her.